Hey everyone, welcome to another Angry Artist podcast. It's no shocker that I really like promoting traditional techniques when it comes to art. However, given that we all have an industry, a job to cater to, generally speaking, we're working with digital paint. However, let me give you something that might be very helpful when it comes to analyzing and creating your artwork. Imagine if every single piece of artwork is done by real paint. Now, that's a little bit vague. Let's specify a few things here. I want you to look at every single piece of artwork as if there's real paint being moved around. Think of actual physical liquid being moved around the canvas. There is actually a lost art when it comes to doing traditional painting. It's the idea of dry brushes versus wet brushes. Imagine when you're analyzing your favorite artists, if their work is primarily digital, how are they achieving that texture, that look that they have in terms of dry brushes or wet brushes? Alright, so why am I really putting this on the table? It's quite simple. Generally speaking, if you really understand how paint works, heck, if you were to just go to the art shop right now, buy a bit of paint, and just test it out for yourself, you might notice that a lot of digital artists would most likely be using wet paint techniques. Now, this is actually a danger. And it's because a lot of people are not aware of digital painting in the terms of traditional painting, our origins. When I go to conventions, I always tell people who ask me that I use traditional techniques in my digital work. A big part of it is avoiding the common traps when it comes to digital painting. And a huge digital painting trap that a lot of people are not aware of when they're working subconsciously is the fact that their work tends to lean with very smooth rendering, very airbrushy looks, and most likely just very wet paint lookish. Don't worry if you're not familiar with traditional painting. Just understand that if things look a bit too smooth, you're most likely looking at very wet paint. So where does the idea of using dry brushes come from? Well, dry brushes are interesting. They create a texture that is very unique. In fact, there's a bit of randomness to it. It's actually very interesting to look at. If you have paint in your house right now, try this out. Have one side where it's a very wet, abundant of paint, and have the other side be a very dry brushstroke. You'll notice that there's a lot of texture in the dry brushes. There is a beauty in creating that texture that digital painters kind of miss. Digital painting has become very perfect because we have the ability to have a trillion layers, a billion undos. We try to create the smoothest look possible. This creates a style that tends to look very similar to each other. And I feel like it starts off from the application of the paint, which is again the idea of wet versus dry paint. Let me put it to you this way. If you're trying to create a more unique look with your digital painting, perhaps you really want to look at what makes traditional painting look unique with one another. So what I mean by that is, okay, let's go back to the idea of digital painting being perfect. The fact that it's so perfect that you can create very smooth rendering, everyone who is professional has the capability of doing that. Anyone listening to this will probably understand what I mean by that. It's that distinct digital look. And people who try to render a bit too much will always end up achieving something that is that look. The very airbrushy, the very wet paint, smooth type of painting. Now, if you're listening to this channel, chances are you are looking for a bit deeper when it comes to creating your style, to find that style. And again, this little thing, the idea of wet versus dry brushing, can make a huge difference when it comes to finding your style that's more unique. Why settle for something that might look the same as everyone else when it comes to rendering? Everyone's using very wet paint, very smooth paint. Now look at your results of just having dry paint. Now, even if you don't try, of course, paint is finite. If you picture yourself as if your paintbrush has actual paint, you realize, of course, the longer you go with your brush, the less paint remains on it. This will inevitably create a dry brush, and that's where the traditional look comes from. Everyone has sort of their own signature, their own movements when it comes to using real paint. Now, in digital painting, brushes are infinite. If you choose one color, you're gonna get that color forever. You're going to miss that spontaneity, your signature strokes, when it comes to using digital painting. Because, of course, if you want a choice, as with everybody else, you have it. And that's digital painting in a nutshell. In traditional painting, there's more chaos. And that chaos creates a more unique look. And again, that starts with just the idea of wet brush versus dry brush. The flow, the dynamic between having a brush filled with paint and having a brush that isn't. That little subtle thing can really change your mentality about it. So, let me put it to you this way. Let's try to create a more unique look, starting with that fundamental at hand. What are you creating with a dry brush if you're using traditional paint? Now try to create that flow, that chaos that might be missing in your work. Again, having things too smooth becomes very production-like. It's not going to create that unique look, because anyone is capable of creating that digital paint look. Now let's try to take the first step and start sort of limiting yourself to make things less than perfect. And that little way of creating that imperfection will tell you a lot about who you are as an artist. Anyways, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next time.